This is the Financially Simple Podcast, a show dedicated to destroying the complexities of money for today's small business owner. And now, here's your host, pizza-loving, certified financial planner, Justin Goodbread.
Welcome to Financially Simple. This is a finance show for small business owners about money, how it works in our business and personal lives, and how we can build wealth to be financially independent. I'm your host, Justin Goodbread, and today is episode 54. Today's episode is titled, How to Negotiate with Vendors and Suppliers. So in our business, vendors and suppliers are common. In fact, many times we have to have vendors and suppliers in order to even operate a business. And the relationships with these vendors and or suppliers can help drive the success of our business. I know in all of my past businesses and in my current businesses, my vendors and or my suppliers help me craft my offerings to my customers. I can remember this one particular vendor, and I'm going to use him as an example throughout today's podcast. I can remember this one particular vendor who helped me drastically in my landscape business in a time of business trouble. And it wasn't a bad thing. We actually had grown too fast, too quick. And I was dealing with the growing pains of business, and I needed some help. And this particular vendor bent over backwards, literally. I mean, this gal actually went out of her way to help me in my business, and I was forever grateful. And this vendor quickly became a lifelong friend. And in fact, today, now some 20-something years removed from my landscape business, anytime I'm in Georgia and I visit this particular restaurant, inevitably I will see this vendor. And this many years later, we still chat and we laugh about, quote, the good old days. Yet, despite the fact that many times vendors become friends or our suppliers become friends, we still often find ourselves having to work with the vendors on pricing, on service, on warranties, and possibly other items. Thus, many of us find ourselves in an uncomfortable position of negotiating with the vendors or suppliers. Let's face it, we're trying to maximize our company's profits through lower cost of goods or lower production time or a higher quality of service. And in fact, isn't that what a vendor's for? They're there to provide us a cost of good, or they're there to provide us a system to help us in lowering our production time, or they're there to help us in a higher quality of service or higher service quality. Someone may say, well, Justin, how in the world can a vendor help us in a higher service quality? I'm reminded of a client of mine who employed a vendor. Employee's not the right word because it wasn't a legal employment, but they worked with a vendor. And this vendor used a strategy called just-in-time delivery systems. And because of the just-in-time delivery system of this particular company, the client was able to provide a higher quality of service for their particular customer base. Yet inevitably, we find ourselves having to negotiate about pricing or about warranties or about service work or possibly even other things. Now, negotiating is an art. There's no doubt about that. Many books, yes, many books have been written on topics. It's truly an art. There's actually college courses on how to negotiate. My business partner took one such course when he was in an MBA program on how to negotiate. The one thing he tells me all the time is, Justin, in negotiation, we always underestimate the amount of pressure on the opposing side. He said that's one of the things he took away from the class. And, that's come to find out that's true. I've experienced that personally in my business. Regardless of your position on the matter of negotiation, the truth be told is that we can all get better at it. We can all improve. We can all make strides at learning how to negotiate better. In this podcast, I'm going to revert back to my landscaping days as an example. Oftentimes I use professional service examples, but today I wanted to recall my days in the sun. In the sun in South Georgia when it was 105, 110 degrees, sweltering heat, and I was very, very tan and very, very lean, much tanner and much lean than I am today. But man, I had some good times. And I want to give you a couple of tips on how you can negotiate with vendors. And the idea is we want to negotiate and remain friends. We want to negotiate and not burn bridges. We want to negotiate and not do harm to anyone. That's the whole idea. We want to obviously reach a consensus that's good for all parties, but we want to do such in a way that's honorable and above reproach. So here's some tips for you. Number 1, realize that the vendor is in a business just like you. Yeah, the vendor, they want to earn a profit. They more than likely have suppliers or vendors themselves. And when you approach the vendor in any manner which is less than understanding of this point, then it has been my experience that the vendor will look at you as if you're questioning their earnings, or that you're attacking their ethos or their core beliefs or the very reason why they're in business. I remember this vendor that I mentioned earlier. When she was in a startup phase, I knew this, and I knew other landscapers in the town who were attempting to take advantage of her during this startup phase. I knew which plants had a lower cost of propagating. In other words, on which plant had the lowest cost in order to get them ready to go to market. Propagation is where you'll move the plant through the potting system to where they're now ready for market. So I knew which plants had the lowest cost, and I also knew which plants that she was having to buy from other suppliers herself. So, for example, a sago palm is a type of palm that's very gorgeous. In fact, I named a dog after it one time, named him Sago. He's a huge mastiff. But the palm sago is a very slow-growing plant. It's not something that you can just split or you can graft or that you can propagate through some sort of a rooting system and then very next year turn around and sell it for hundreds or thousands of dollars. It's not the case. There are sago palms which are 50, 60, 80, 100 years old. And I knew that this young supplier, that she was having to buy these sagos from another supplier, another nursery stock. And it just wasn't right to go in and beat up her pricing points, as I knew she was working on a marginal type rate. On the other hand, there were some other plants that she was propagating, some grasses, some bushy ornamentals that she was propagating, which now she had a little bit more room for margin. So my first point is simply this. Remember, the vendor is trying to earn a profit just like you. They want to do things which are honorable, above reproach, just like you do. And so oftentimes I forget that the vendors are in business just like me. So that's my first point. Now, the second point I have is you want to learn your vendor. You want to know who the person is that you're talking with. What are they like? What traits do they have? What do you know about their family? What do you know about their goals in life? There's a study done by the Journal of Applied Psychology with a Jared Curhan, I believe is how you pronounce it, Curhan, and a Alex Pitland of MIT. And I'll put a link to this in the show notes. But one of the interesting studies from the Journal of Applied Psychology that these two individuals surmise and are able to prove, I believe they did a good job, they actually derived that the outcome of any negotiation can be predicted in the first 5 minutes of the conversation. So whenever you know the person to whom you're negotiating with, you're better prepared within the first 5 minutes to actually win the negotiation. I knew that this young female vendor was interested in, quote, buying my business. I knew that. The vendor was young. She was eager to grow her business. And by me using this vendor, she could then say to my competitors that, hey, Justin and his company use me. And it gave her credibility instantly. So I knew in my negotiations with her that she needed a good, solid landscaping company in my marketplace that she could tout was a customer, because she told me before I ever reached the negotiating table. She told me that, man, Justin, I want to buy your business. Not in the sense that she wanted to pay me money for my landscape business, but more importantly, she wanted to reduce her prices in such a way that I could not say no to using her particular service. So if at all possible, you want to learn who your vendor is or who your supplier is. Learn the person to whom you're negotiating with. Now, many times we can't do that, obviously, but if you can, learn who it is. And remember that in the first 5 minutes of negotiating, there is a predicted outcome which can come about. So the better you know them, the more prepared you are, the better you are at winning, using that term, you're negotiating. The third thing is you want to prepare your request. So negotiating 101. The more you prepare for the task of negotiating, the smoother the negotiating will usually be. Not always, but often. And if you prepare for the negotiation, then you will learn facts which could particularly help you in your negotiating. So let me give you a scenario in this particular negotiating that I did some 25 years ago with this young nursery woman. I can remember specifically that I needed particular plants. I needed azaleas. I needed loropetalum. I needed grasses like fountain grass and Aztec grass and liriope or lirio, depending on how you want to say that. I knew that we needed these things in order to operate this typical landscape style that I drafted. And I knew that the cost of a 3-gallon azalea, so a 3-gallon azalea in the springtime would be maybe a little smaller than the summer, but it would be probably an 18 by 20 inch plant. I knew that a 3-gallon azalea would cost this nursery woman about $1.50 per plant. And that cost included the labor that she was having to pay her team, the mulch, the water, the fertilizer, the fertigation in this case. I knew about the cost. So whenever the price sheet for the public showed that this 3-gallon azalea at the time was about $14 price, I knew the markup involved. And so whenever I knew the markup involved, I wanted to get some other ideas on what the other nurseries were charging for people in my position who were ordering thousands of these plants or tens of thousands potentially these plants in a given year. And I knew that other nursery people were charging between $6 to $7 a plant. So whenever I negotiated the price of azaleas with this particular individual, I can remember starting off at a number which was fair, albeit not cheap. So I knew that the other markets were starting off at around $7 to $8 for a 3-gallon plant. So I started off at $5. And obviously, if I were in her position, I wouldn't have taken a $5 a plant cost. What she did do was we finally negotiated a $5.75% per plant cost for a 3-gallon azalea. And there were some things that excluded. So, for example, an Encore azalea is a particular licensed azalea. She obviously couldn't sell me that style azalea for that price. But your bread and butter, purple and whites and reds, she could sell to me. So the more we are prepared for this negotiating step, the more likely we are to win. And I'm using that word win very loosely, but the more likely we are to win the contest.
You are listening to Financially Simple, destroying the complexities of money for today's small business owner.
The fourth point is, what is the vendor's motivation? Do you know what they, the vendor, the supplier, can gain from the arrangement or the arrangement of providing you with supplies? What's in it for them? As I mentioned earlier, this particular female landscaper, she was trying to penetrate the market. She knew that having my business would help her in a very strong marketplace in Southeast Georgia. She knew that. And so thus, whenever we began working together, she could use my reference as a possibility of selling to other landscapers in that area. So her motivation was simply gaining me for her long-term proliferation of her business. My motivation was getting a fair price on a product so that I could, in turn, turn a profit in my company. So what is the vendor's motivation? That's important to know. And as you're learning this vendor, point number 2, as you're becoming friends with this vendor early on, it helps to know what their motivation is. And so if you just listen as they talk, you can often identify what the motivation is for them. I know in some other areas, I think particularly a dentist company, there's a particular company that's motivated to sell 5 particular products, or the sales guy has to sell 5 products of this $120,000 piece of equipment. The reason why they're motivated is because if they sell 5 products, they get an increase on their bonus structure at year end. So they're often motivated to offer other incentives so that you can buy this $100,000 piece of equipment. So if you understand the motivation, many times you can work on other negotiating points. The fifth thing that we'll look at is provide the supplier or the vendor with an expectation of your annual product flow. You don't want to lie about this. You don't want to lie. But you can make assumptions as to the estimated amount of products that you're going to need to grow your business over the course of a year. I can remember when I look at the numbers of a full landscape, I remember this number specifically, because the first time I saw this, I was like, holy Batman, that's a lot of plants. But I expected, and I knew that one of my favorite plants, I would use a lot of it. It's called an Aztec grass. And basically it can be used for hedging. It can be used for bordering. It can be used for accent plants. It was a grass that grew up about 12 inches tall, maybe 14 if it had the right nutrients. But it was white. It was variegated. It was a white grass. And if you planted it beneath a dark, non-glossy foundation plant, it was pretty. It worked great against sago palms. It worked great with daylilies or other lightly colored green flowering plants. And I just loved this grass. And it was a popular grass that many landscapers used. And I knew that I could probably use about 100 plants per average landscape. I knew that. Now, my goal was to do 100 jobs in a year. That means it was possible for me to need 10,000 1-gallon plants, 1-gallon Aztec plants in a typical summer. And if I purchased 10,000 plants, man, what type of price point could this particular supplier provide me? I can remember talking with her and she said, Justin, you sure do use a lot of these Aztec grasses. I'm like, yeah, I'm looking at the possibility of hiring somebody and propagating our own. What you would do is you would actually get a big clump of Aztec grass and you'd pay somebody to pot up some mulch and then split up the Aztec grass. And you could, out of one 12-inch clump, you may be able to get 200 individual plants. And if you grew them and kept them watered, then all of a sudden in about a year to 2 years' time, depending on the amount of fertilizer you throw on them, you can end up having some very nice plants. And I can remember telling her, yeah, I'm thinking about hiring somebody to help me with these plants. And she's like, don't do that, man. Don't do that. Just continue to buy them from me. And I said, man, you got to give me a price break here. And so whenever I ran the numbers, I'm like, look, here's what my goal is. My goal is to have 100 jobs. Now, did I ever hit 100 jobs? No, but that was my goal. And I can remember her saying, man, Justin, you're talking 10,000 plants. If I had 10,000 plants in a year, I would discount it by $1 a plant, which is not an insignificant amount. It was like a 33% reduction. I think we were at about $3 per plant. So it's going to drop to $2 a plant. That's not insignificant. And I mean, that's $20,000 in profit straight line just by the pure negotiating. And I said, yeah, but I can't guarantee it. And she said, that's okay. Based on your flow, I think I'll go ahead and drop you to $1 a plant. And instead of you having to hire people to do this particular potting, we'll just continue to use my services. And so we did. Now, one thing you've got to be careful at when you're projecting what you potentially could use is you want to make sure that the supplier doesn't require you to meet your obligation for pricing points. So in other words, if I said, I want to hit 100 landscapes this year, I anticipate that if I hit 100, I use an average of 100 plants in a landscape. That's 10,000 plants. And she could say, well, Justin, if you order 10,000 plants, I'll give you $1 a plant. But if you don't, I'm not going to give you that. And that's not the agreement we had. So you want to make sure that your supplier doesn't require you to meet an obligation, but you can set your flow. You can set your expectation. And actually, it helps you and the supplier. It helps you each prepare for your product or your business flow. And that leads me into my sixth point. My sixth point is this. You never accept the first pricing offer. I mean, this is just basic business. We don't do it in real estate. When someone comes and offers us a price for our house or we're trying to buy or trying to sell, we never accept it. Whenever you're settling a lawsuit, you never accept the first offer. Whenever you're selling your business, you never accept the first offer. I mean, that's just common. Now, obviously, there's exceptions. We all know that. But as a general rule, we never accept the first offer. It's just basic business. So whenever you get your offer, you want to prepare with a counteroffer. Be prepared with a counteroffer. Or you may have the vendor go back and ask you for better pricing. I remember one time when I ordered palm trees. This particular supplier, she would inevitably attempt to raise my price per unit on an individual order. And I understood why. The market price would move very fast on palm trees. It just would at that particular point back in the late 90s, early 2000. And I would often have to position the conversation for a repricing strategy. And many times I had to be willing to walk away from her and potentially use a competitor. I had to. So whenever we're in negotiating standpoints, we never want to accept the first offer. You just don't want to do it. You want to always be ready with a counter or be willing to walk away. You may have to do that sometime or have them come back with a better price. And that brings me to my next point. You just don't want to have one supplier. this nursery woman was the only supplier I would have ever used in my business, then in fact, if she had a glitch in her business, it could have affected mine drastically. So by having multiple suppliers, I could receive the same product from different suppliers if there was a hiccup, or if I made a mistake in positioning a particular product. Let's say all of a sudden I did need 10,000 Aztec grass at one time and there was no way she had that in stock. I now had multiple suppliers at my beckoning who could help me provide that particular order. See, we don't want to make the mistake of positioning our future success of our company on the back of one supplier, because when that supplier has an adjustment, whatever that adjustment is, good or bad, then our company will be affected and potentially negatively. Perhaps number 8, one of the best things I can tell you in negotiating is negotiate in the off season. Now, it's easy to understand off season in context of nursery or in context of landscaping. But here's what I mean by that. When the supplier's in the off season, you can often gain your best pricing. It would have been foolish for me to go to her and request decrease in pricing or additional services in the heat of the spring or summer. That'd have been foolish. That is the busiest time for a nursery. That is when all their work from the fall and winter is actually coming to fruition. That's when they're going crazy delivering jobs all over. However, in the fall, after the rush of the planting is done and when people's minds, whenever the average consumer's minds are far away from their landscape, this nursery supplier often had their weakest sales month. Knowing when the weakest sales month is for the supplier is often the best time to negotiate. It's often the strongest month for the buyer to go in and work on pricing. So look at your business. And it may not be as cyclical as a nursery business. It could be. It could be more cyclical than a nursery business. I know, for example, that in certain businesses like the school industry, the summertime is a good time to negotiate with schools regarding their supplies. Why? Because school's not in session. So look at your particular business and find out when the weakest month is, the weakest sales month for your supplier is. And that's whenever you often will want to go and work on negotiating from a buyer's perspective. Now, number 9, this is my last point. Know when to back down. You know, I always wanted to be a customer that the suppliers look forward to do business with. I wanted to pay on time. And I still do. I want to pay on time. I want to be pleasant to work with. I don't want to be that customer that we all hate to see coming. I mean, in our business, we all have those customers that's like, man, here we go. Let's get ready. And you almost have to put on a suit of armor in order to get prepared for that customer as they come through the door. I don't want to be that guy. I'm going to go back to point number 1. Remember, the supplier is in business to make money, just like you. The supplier is trying to feed their families, just like you. The supplier is trying to turn a profit, just like you. So whenever you're negotiating with a vendor, you want to be fair. You don't want to attempt to steal the vendor's time or profits. So inevitably, sometimes you just have to back down. And with that, I'll leave you with this quote from John F. Kennedy, and it's one that I really like on the topic of negotiating. He says, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining me on the Financially Simple podcast. As always, the show notes and links for today's podcast can be found at financiallysimple.com under the heading podcast. While you're there on the blog, feel free to sign up for our weekly newsletter. Every week I release tax tips, business planning tips, wealth management tips, and so much more. It's some of my best writing I do, and it's yours. Just sign up. Hey, if you like the show, please subscribe. Share the podcast with other business owners. And like I say every week, life is hard. Life is good. Life can be frustrating. Negotiating, that can be the devil to some people. Hey, look, money never has to be these things. Money doesn't have to be frustrating. Let's continue to make our lives at least financially simple. Y'all go out and create a great day.
You have been listening to the Financially Simple podcast. The information in this show is for informational purposes only. This show is not investment advice. Instead, seek help from a competent financial advisor. Justin Goodbread, CFP, is an investment advisor representative of Heritage Investors, a registered investment advisor.